All right. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Gartrell, and I serve as the director of the John O. Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture and the David M. Rubenstein Library at Duke University. I'm so thrilled to have you all join us for this wonderful program today and to be a part of the Franklin Research Center's 25th anniversary commemoration. And so this academic year, we are celebrating our silver anniversary, and we are using the theme of Black Lives in Archives as the thread for a slate of programs and projects that will build upon the center's mission of advancing scholarship on the history and culture of people of African descent. And today is actually the last in our fall Black Lives in Archives speaker series. And our speaker today will be Dr. Emilye Crosby. Dr. Crosby is a professor of history at SUNY Geneseo and is a past recipient of a John O. Franklin Research Center travel grant. And she actually visited the Rubenstein Library to do research in our collections. And her talk will focus on finding SNCC women in the archive. She's been a faculty member in the history department at SUNY Geneseo since 1995, where she teaches African American history and the modern civil rights movement. She's received numerous awards for teaching, scholarship, and service, including the Chancellor's Award for Teaching, the Harder Mentoring Award, the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Faculty Service, and the President's Award for Research and Creativity. She's also the author of A Little Taste of Freedom, the Black Freedom Struggle in Claiborne County, Mississippi, which won the McLemore Prize and was awarded an honorable mention for the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Prize. And she's also edited Civil Rights History from the Ground Up, Local Struggles, a National Movement. Please feel free to swing by the John O. Franklin Research Center's webpage to learn more about our spring semester events. We've really enjoyed hosting our previous travel grants for the fall semester. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crosby.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction and the invitation. I'm really delighted and honored to be part of the series. I'd also like to thank Naomi Nelson and the many, many people who make the Duke Archive such a wonderful resource. I'm currently working on a book-length project tentatively called Anything I Was Big Enough to Do, Women and Gender in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you don't know SNCC, they were the youth-led organization that emerged from the 1960 sit-ins and remained on the cutting edge of the movement. But before I get to that, I thought I'd start with a big moment in the archives that was personal to me. When I was in graduate school, on one of my first major research trips, I was working in the NAACP papers at the Library of Congress. At the time, I was working on what became my first book, Civil Rights Movement in My Home Community. And I was finding it hard to find much about the small underground branch of the local NAACP. A little snippet here and there. But when I uncovered a folder full of information about a protest at the local Black college, then called Alcorn A&M. In 1957, students held a major protest when a history professor published a series of articles criticizing the NAACP. In response, students began protesting. The all-white State Board of Trustees shut the college down, removed the president, and made the students go through an interview process where they and their parents had to sign a statement saying that they wouldn't participate in any additional protests. Students who were considered the leaders were expelled and not allowed back into school. The NAACP got involved by trying to help those who had been expelled transfer to other schools. And I was really excited to finally have this folder full of information, bringing the protest to life. And I'm going through it, and I saw the name of my high school basketball and track coach, Mason Denham. It just jumped out at me. I was like, wow, Coach Denham was part of this protest. Here he is in the Library of Congress. He had told me many, many stories over the years, but I didn't remember this one. And unfortunately, he had passed away, so I couldn't ask him about the protest and his involvement. I did know that he graduated from Alcorn, and knowing Coach Denham, he must have talked his way back into school. So I wanted to start with that just because it's one of my favorite moments, and just a reminder that you never know what you'll find in an archive. For the rest of my presentation, I'm going to focus on SNCC women, especially aspects of the history that intersect with some of Duke's collections that I've had the opportunity to use. I'm going to start with a couple pieces of misinformation and misportrayals that have dominated early discussions of SNCC women. And they've done serious damage and provided a really problematic framing or starting point for those who have tried to address the history with more nuance. In an October 2017 article titled "The Left Needs to Confront Its Own Sexual Assault Problem," author Alex Press turned to an often misused anecdote about Stokely Carmichael, a key member of SNCC, writing, quote, "Carmichael said the only position for women in the Black Power movement was prone." For decades, Carmichael and the prone comment have been used as a particularly notable example of 1960s era sexism that helped inspire the women's liberation movement. Like Plant, however, many people have gotten the incident wrong, taking as serious what was an in-joke made to a circle of friends and comrades during a November 1964 staff retreat in Waveland, Mississippi. Rather than making a serious comment reflecting sexist inclinations, Carmichael was playfully teasing a couple white SNCC women who had earlier distributed a position paper calling out discrimination against women. Casey Hayden and Mary King, the best known authors and the women at the center of the Carmichael joke, have been outspoken in trying to correct mischaracterizations of Carmichael's comment, and along with their SNCC colleagues, the idea that SNCC was particularly sexist. Unfortunately, Carmichael's joke and the position paper has been a starting place for most of the scholarly attention to women in SNCC. This limited framework is especially problematic since, despite its founding in the context of an explicitly sexist society that included legalized discrimination, SNCC was atypical and noteworthy in the space women found and created for developing and using their talents. This misinformation was part of my motivation for doing the research on women and gender in SNCC. My students would always say, why was SNCC so sexist? And I found it really frustrating, and I was trying to figure out how to change that perception. And so my approach is to start from the organization's founding in 1960, rather than with this key moment of misinformation that came more than 6 years later. However, for this presentation, in part because I relied heavily on the Duke archives to investigate this, I'm going to focus on the misinformation, a history that, among other things, is far too centered on the experiences of white women, and that becomes then the stand-in for all women in SNCC. Before I get into the details, let me give you a little background on this history for those who aren't already familiar with it. In November 1964, in a contentious staff meeting held in Waveland, Mississippi, SNCC staff were invited to write position papers on anything they wanted. There's a long list of papers, many of them unsigned, many of them signed, but a few anonymous. On the list is a paper with the following information: SNCC position paper, name withheld by request, women in the movement. By all accounts, the paper was developed collectively by a group of women, probably all or mostly white, led by Mary King and Casey Hayden, who were at the time well respected, but a bit uncertain of their standing as the organization's racial attitudes were evolving. King's and Hayden's roughly two-page paper asserted that the men controlled most of the organization's decision-making. It listed a handful of examples where male leadership was assumed, and it charged that women were typically limited to stereotypical female work. They also contended that many women were unhappy with assumptions of male superiority, and moreover, that the movement was wasting, quote, much talent and experience, end quote, by not giving women, quote, jobs commensurate with their abilities. While the paper was presented anonymously, very quickly people suspected or knew that Mary and Casey were the authors. One night on the pier, as the group was relaxing drinking a little and enjoying the Mississippi night and each other's company, Stokely Carmichael began what some have described as being like a stand-up comedy routine, making fun of various people, including Trinidadians like himself. In the context, he asked out loud, "What is the position of women in SNCC?" And everybody knew he was alluding to the paper. And he answered himself, "The position of women in SNCC is prone." And at the time, everybody laughed. SNCC was full of young people, and by all accounts, there was lots of sex. About a year later, Casey and Mary wrote another more polished piece, which they distributed to women they knew in civil rights and New Left circles, called, quote, "A Kind of Memo, Sex and Caste." It was published in 1966 and considered a founding document on the women's liberation movement. Although a number of people in women's liberation circles credit SNCC's Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who was an African-American woman, with writing the 1964 position paper, there's no evidence that she was involved. And none of the people closest to either the memo or Robinson believe she was connected in any way. It might be useful to know a little about Ruby Doris Smith Robinson anyway, because she plays a star role in the misinformation. A young Black woman, she was a sophomore at Spelman College when the sit-in started, and she quickly got involved. She was one of the first people outside of Nashville to respond to Diane Nash's call to keep the Freedom Rides going when it looked like they might be called off. Earlier, she had joined 3 other SNCC colleagues in going to Rock Hill, South Carolina, where she spent 30 days in jail as they tried to kickstart a jail no bail movement. By 1963, she dropped out of school and was working full-time for SNCC. She was a major force in the office, writing at one point a very understated job description indicating that she was in charge of the Sojourner motor fleet, that was SNCC's hundreds of cars, and in charge of SNCC's personnel, hundreds of staff. In 1966, she was elected executive director, replacing Jim Foreman, who had held the position since 1961 and been responsible for much of the work of building SNCC's infrastructure. She was one of the few women to hold a formal title in SNCC, but one of the many to have a huge impact on the organization. So where does the misinformation come from? SNCC veteran Mary King was the first person to try to track it down. And in her memoir, Freedom Song, she points to Robin Morgan's edited book, Sisterhood is Powerful, published in 1970. Here, Morgan spread the idea that Ruby Doris wrote the position paper on women. She also vilified Stokely Carmichael and made his comment about the position of women in SNCC infamous. Morgan printed a version of Carmichael's joke as a serious statement in a section titled, quote, "Know Your Enemy," a sampling of sexist quotes. I wanted to know where Morgan got her information, and in my search, the Duke Women's Liberation Print Culture Collection has been very helpful. I found that Morgan's details and conclusions are echoed almost verbatim by other published works emerging from the women's liberation movement in the late 1960s and 1970s. In fact, Duke's collection includes several earlier pieces by Robin Morgan herself that include similar details. In an essay for Liberation published in 1968, she writes, "What's frivolous about the young Black woman, proud and beautiful and militant, whose spirit cracks when she hears Stokely say the only position for women in SNCC is prone?" Similar comments are in Morgan's 1968 draft of Miss America essay. Other writings from the women's liberation movement appear to precisely repeat these details. For example, in Notes from the Third Year, Women's Liberation, New York radical women wrote, "Often there is such a strong, open reaction against the female culture that the females of the suppressed national or racial group are threatened and defined as castrating females if they don't become invisible and get where they belong in the subservient female culture into silence and prone, as Stokely Carmichael once said. Marlene Dixon, in Where Are We Going, published in a Radical America special edition a special edition on women, published in February 1970, referenced the familiar Carmichael quote as rebuttal to the position paper that Ruby Doris supposedly wrote. In the same issue, Vilma Sanchez made almost the same point, ending the story of Ruby Doris's paper and Stokely by writing, "The laughter evoked was sufficient to negate any discussion of the question put forward by the most powerful woman in SNCC." Carmichael's Prone also appeared in Maxine Williams' Black Women and the Struggle for Liberation, published first in The Militant in 1970 and reprinted and distributed in a pamphlet titled Black Women's Liberation. And it was also in the Black Women's Manifesto, distributed by the Third World Women's Alliance. SNCC was an extraordinary organization with more women and more space for women than any comparable organization. And it's extraordinarily sad that most women organizing in the late 60s and early 70s knew only these inaccurate tidbits. SNCC's real history would have been so much more helpful. After finding these examples that followed Morgan so closely, I became even more interested in figuring out where her information came from. So far, my best lead is an obituary for Ruby Doris Robinson written by Myrna Wood, a white Canadian woman who worked in SNCC's Atlanta office for a short time after Freedom Summer, which was 1964. Published in Bulletin of the New Left Committee in November 1967, the obituary includes both of the central pieces of misinformation, that Robinson wrote the position paper and that Carmichael's Prone comment was a serious put down during a formal presentation of the paper. Wood joined the women's liberation movement after leaving SNCC, and it seems likely that directly or indirectly, her piece was Morgan's source. Wood's obituary begins with a strong description of Robinson's role in SNCC. She wrote, "Ruby Doris Smith Robinson was the heartbeat of SNCC for 7 years and its main administrator. With an iron hand, she controlled personnel, finance, and the SNCC cars. Every requirement for a SNCC person, in effect, had to be okayed by Ruby Doris." In terms of the misinformation, the following quote is key. Wood wrote, "Ruby Doris insisted on the right of women to participate in the struggle. Besides going to jail, she attempted to make the Black chauvinist men in the organization think about freedom now. At the fall conference in 1964, Ruby Doris presented a position paper on the role of women in the movement. Discussion was effectively stopped by that great liberation leader, Stokely Carmichael, who said the only position for women in SNCC is prone." Where did Myrna Wood's information come from? I interviewed her, and she told me that she had included things that she'd heard about Ruby Doris from other people, but she couldn't remember who. While I have no way to directly connect them yet, I hope to someday, if they were connected. One of the people who might have influenced her was Linda Cease. She was a white volunteer who worked in Carmichael's district during the 1964 summer project, and she also embraced women's liberation. Her essay, "You've Come a Long Way, Baby, Women in the Movement," was written for a 1969 Motive magazine special issue on women's liberation and reprinted in The New Woman in 1970. I guess that's The New Women in 1970. Cease was very bitter about the limits white women experienced in the movement. She opens with the now overly familiar Carmichael quote and then continues, "This aptly expresses SNCC's opinion toward women in general. The attitude toward white women was even worse. White women were not permitted to do voter registration work, but were relegated to teaching and community center work with old people and little kids. White women were not allowed to leave their homes after dark. Use of project funds and cars was forbidden. And of course, women were expected to do the laundry, cooking, and cleaning. The first question when a woman arrived at a project was, 'Can you type?' The first paid SNCC worker was Jane Stembridge, who was a typist. Jane later proved to be a gifted poet. And I can attest from my work in the SNCC archives, Stembridge was also someone with considerable autonomy who was well respected. Cease also repeated the story of Ruby Doris presenting the position paper and being shouted down, and included information about Casey and Mary's second paper. I wanted to share a few different opinions on what Cease said about the limits white women faced, just to offer a little nuance. Joyce Ladner described the driving skills of some SNCC men, and she saw their assertiveness about driving as brotherly protection. Betty Garman described being in a car that was being chased by white men. When Jack Minnis, another white man, told her to drive faster, she told him that he should drive, and they switched without stopping. Joni Rabinowitz described her excitement when Reverend Walls let her drive his car. Dottie Zellner described Jim Foreman asking if she could type. She was thrilled to say yes and have a way to contribute to the movement. When she told him she could also write, he immediately assigned her to the communications department with Julian Bond. Jane Stembridge also told me that when she was pestering Bob Moses because she wanted to work in the field, he did let her move to Mississippi and work in Greenwood. But first she had to agree to stay in a house that was very close to the office, only go back and forth at dark, either before light or after dark. And she had to agree to stay in this house that was an all-female household, because otherwise she would be a danger to the movement. Joyce Ladner says that she was never asked if she could type, but she did type because she had the skill and was happy to contribute. So those are just a few examples of many that I could give that show how complex this history is. Scholar Robin Spencer, in her work on the Black Panther Party, makes an important observation. She says the Panthers didn't have a formal division of labor based on gender, but the skills that people came with were shaped by the gender roles of the larger society. But back to the misinformation. For the moment, I'm stuck here. I believe it's possible that Cease is living, and if so, I'd love to talk to her. Did she and Myrna Woods cross paths? It seems possible, since Cease was in Mississippi in summer of '64 and Wood traveled to Mississippi sometime after that, but I don't know. Was Cease Wood's source, or was she also following Wood's lead? I'm hoping the archives will provide some hint. But from 1967 through 1970, Wood, Cease, and Morgan all published pieces with virtually identical information about Ruby Doris Smith. And while Morgan and her book likely reached the widest audience, it's likely that all of them influenced the misinformation as it spread throughout women's liberation circles and writing. While I'm not addressing it here, unfortunately, the same information, the same wrong information, made it into a wide range of writing, including women's studies and women's history texts. And as my quote at the beginning shows, it's still circulating in some circles. Wherever the misinformation started, there are a number of key differences in how Carmichael's comment shows up in the story told by women and men in SNCC. The women's liberation movement, Carmichael as evidence of sexism, almost always includes the term only, as in the only position for women. In addition, it's often combined or connected to the position paper, as in Carmichael used the phrase to shout down or prevent any discussion of the paper. In contrast, the SNCC version never includes the term only and insists that Carmichael made the comment not during a meeting or when the paper was presented, but later that night or weekend when the group was relaxing out on the pier. The people who have been most insistent about those details are Mary King and Casey Hayden, who SNCC people agree are also the two people most important to its authorship. One of the first times SNCC women collectively addressed the misinformation about Stokely and their larger experience as women was at a SNCC organized conference at Trinity College in 1988. Mary King helped plan the conference and was likely key in including and shaping a panel on women. The transcript was edited and published as Circle of Trust by Cheryl Greenberg, if anyone's interested. But here, position paper authors King and Hayden were paired with two Black women who had also worked on SNCC's staff, Jean Wheeler Smith Young and Joyce Ladner. These four women, along with Prathia Hall and Bernice Johnson Regan, two other Black women staffers, laid out their thoughts on SNCC women. One part of that was anger over how they'd been portrayed. These women placed the position paper in the context of SNCC's internal culture, which encouraged people to raise questions, to identify and address contradictions. Mary King, for example, notes, quote, in SNCC's radical egalitarian tradition, we could say anything we wanted to say, write about any topic, challenge the staff to anything we wanted to challenge them to. She adds, quote, what was unique about SNCC was its openness to these questions, that it could nourish Casey Hayden and me and others to ask these questions, to write these papers, end quote. For her part, Casey Hayden points out that for many people, SNCC was transformative, that, quote, a lot of the old definitions fell away. They weren't appropriate anymore. You really stopped thinking about yourself in terms of the limitations of sex or class or race. The panelists emphasized the significance of other women, some older, some their age, as role models, particularly Ella Baker, who facilitated SNCC's founding, and the many community women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Victoria Gray, who emerged through SNCC's organizing. Ella Baker had fought against chauvinism much of her life, and she talked about this with at least some of the young people in SNCC. Moreover, Baker was, as Jean Wheeler Young noted, clearly, quote, functioning at her potential. In other words, she did not let others' ideas about what women should or should not do limit her role or ability to work. The SNCC women on the Trinity panel described the work they did, what it meant for them to be part of the organization, and some of the ways that their experiences did not conform to the traditional gender roles of the larger society. Jean Wheeler Smith Young recalls that when Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were missing, and the staff assumed correctly that they had been murdered, a group of SNCC people went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to do the dangerous work of looking for them. She was among the volunteers and, quote, nobody ever said, you're a girl, you can't go. There was just no thought that I couldn't go at this very stressful time into this dangerous situation because I was a woman. Joyce Ladner pointed out that in SNCC, relationships were defined first and foremost by the task at hand, a point Prathia Hall reinforced, noting, quote, when everybody was wounded, then whoever could get up first was the one who had to get up first and move. That was just a reality. Over the years, Ladner and others have argued that while men did hold most of the titled positions in SNCC, those titles never mattered very much. For Jean Wheeler Smith Young, this was true because, quote, I just had so much freedom to decide how I was going to work and so much support for my decisions. She adds, women had access to whatever resources and decision-making they needed to have or wanted to have, and I don't remember being impeded in this, end quote. SNCC women also highlighted the strength it took for anyone to join the organization. As Ladner asserted, people in SNCC, quote, challenged authority, and the faint-hearted didn't last. So while Robin Morgan probably did a good bit to spread the misinformation about the position paper in Carmichael, giving people a misleading understanding of women's roles and experiences in SNCC, many SNCC women were pretty frustrated with another early book, Sarah Evans' 1979 Personal Politics, which tackled the relationship between the civil rights and New Left movements and the emergence of women's liberation. Evans' book became very important because it was among the first history books to provide a significant discussion of women in SNCC. I bring it up partially for that reason, but also because Evans donated her paper to Duke, so people like me can revisit her research, including early interviews with a few SNCC women. Joyce Ladner called Evans' work out by name during the Trinity Conference. She also addressed it in an interview conducted 2 years earlier by Joseph Sinsheimer. He also generously donated his interviews and research to the Duke Archive. And I should say here, Sinsheimer's interviews are an example of the kind of sources we need for a more nuanced understanding of SNCC's history. For the most part, they have a broader focus than the Evans interviews, with questions about the people and the events that made up the movement. However, in his interview with Ladner, he tentatively asked the question about sexism. He said, I'm trying to think how to ask this question without it being loaded, but what would you make of the whole issue of sexism in the movement? Ladner responded, yeah, well, I didn't experience it. And in fact, it came as rather as a jolt when Mary King and other women in SNCC talked about it, because I've really thought about this a lot, because the feeling is quite likely that some of the white women did experience it. I don't remember them ever talking about it. I was never privy to their conversations where it was an issue for them. She continued, quote, But I can't help but feel that Sarah Evans got a lot of it wrong. She really didn't understand what she was writing about. Ladner continued her critique, quote, "She got it wrong, missed a great part of it because she didn't understand the context, the texture of the relationships. She didn't talk to the right people. That was her first problem." Ladner goes on to speak both generally and specifically, pointing to the different experiences of white women related to the danger that was inherent in their identity as white women. She also addressed some of the issues that some white women like Linda Cease brought up: women's access to cars and the expectation that women should do the typing. Despite Ladner's critique of Evans' work, and I have my own critique of Evans' book and her approach to the research, her monograph did move in the right direction by correcting the pervasive misinformation about the author of the first position paper. And in fact, researchers can follow her progress as she starts with the Ruby Doris mythology and eventually learns that Mary King and Casey Hayden were primary authors of the mysterious paper. In terms of Carmichael, Evans used the same language as Morgan and others by including, quote, "only," and presented his actions in a somewhat ambiguous way, leaving it open to interpretation. And this might be a good place to say that most SNCC women have positive feelings about Carmichael and even see Stokely as one of the men who is particularly supportive of them. The archival record reinforces this. For example, most of the women who served as project directors were appointed by Carmichael. At the same time, there's some evidence to suggest that Carmichael enjoyed his own joke so much that he repeated it a number of times. Jennifer Lawson told me that by the time she heard it, it wasn't funny anymore. Dottie Zellner remembers that when Carmichael began to rise to speak during the women's panel at the Trinity Conference, his SNCC colleague, Cortland Cox, pulled him back down and suggested he'd already said more than enough. Evans' portrayal of SNCC women was more nuanced than the narrow references in previous women's liberation writings. However, in part because her focus was on the roots of women's liberation in civil rights and New Left organizing, Evans primarily addressed those aspects of SNCC's history that were most directly connected to the women's liberation movement. One result was that she emphasized the experiences of white women, including staff and summer volunteers who went into the women's movement in larger numbers, interracial sex, and the Hayden King papers on gender discrimination. Though Evans was better than most in noting that SNCC had more space for women than its peer and successor organizations in the white New Left, perhaps because her book was the first to address women in any substantive way, SNCC women, her narrow focus came to define SNCC women for many people and reinforced the earlier mythologies. Probably the most problematic aspect of her book was her unacknowledged focus on white women. She made repeated references to women when she explicitly means white women. Moreover, in personal politics, the Black women in SNCC are most relevant for the ways they influenced white women. Evans' assumptions show up in her interview questions and her approach to the archival materials. She asked many women about sexism, about interracial sex, interracial tension, and what she initially referred to as the Ruby Doris Robinson memo. There's much less focus on the work itself. When she was interviewing Mary King and asked her about the Ruby Doris memo, King didn't even realize that Evans was referring to the memo that she had actually written. If the question had been more open-ended, she might have mentioned her own memo. Casey Hayden, though she has later emphasized her own memory blanks and uncertainty around the memo, did claim it in an interview with Evans and helped correct the misunderstanding. Evans' papers provide little snippets that are interesting, though not essential to the history. For example, her papers suggest that she developed a warm relationship with both Mary King and later Casey Hayden. The papers also reveal that Evans didn't actually access the memo until late in her research when SNCC historian Claiborne Carson read one of her essays and sent it to her. Evans' assumptions also meant that she focused on specific things she was looking for and anything related to sexism. For example, she had a set of reports by Joni Rabinowitz, a white woman working in Southwest Georgia, probably in 1963. Rabinowitz was part of an old left family and was probably exposed to what was called the woman question. And she repeatedly commented on the fact that women and not men were expected to do housework. She points out examples with the refrain, the woman's role. While this is important and interesting, Evans does not appear to have analyzed the rest of the papers, which provide rich evidence of the significant roles SNCC and local women and girls were playing in the local movement. While I haven't tried counting names, women are the clear majority of the people canvassing and registering to vote. And there's other evidence suggesting women leading meetings, making decisions, and playing central roles. Rabinowitz herself asserts that political work was shared, while housework was left to women. While Rabinowitz wasn't wrong to reject women's double day, given the context, it's not surprising that women did more housework, but it is surprising that women shared political work, surprising in the larger context of the society at the time. This past summer, I was at Emory going through the papers of Lenora Tate, another Black Spelman activist who was involved in the early days of the sit-in movement. One of her letters gives us a nice snapshot of Ruby Doris and the fact that she had a bigger impact in meetings when some of the louder men were arrested and no longer taking up too much space. Tate wrote, quote, "Now with the big shouters and talkers gone, people like Ruby Doris talk. And it's clear from the context she saw this as a good thing." As I mentioned, Evans does note that SNCC was more open to women than other organizations, but she does little to show how and why SNCC was so remarkable on this front. To really understand that, we have to dig further. In examining this history, it's also very important to acknowledge and bring a nuanced understanding to the different experiences of Black and white women. Because white supremacists were hysterical about the possibility of white female Black male sex, the issue of white women field workers had always been fraught with potential danger for them and their co-workers. As a result, white women did face more restrictions than their African-American counterparts. In her interview with Sarah Evans, Mary King said that at one point she believed that violence was exacerbated when white women began working on a project. In this context, the limits white women faced really were about protecting everyone, not about sexism. There were also big differences between the experiences of SNCC staff and volunteers, and between SNCC staff before Freedom Summer, when the organization was smaller and more close-knit. Intersectionality can be a buzzword, but it's key here. There is really no way you can analyze the experiences of SNCC women without being sensitive to the nuances of race. There was no single women's experience, but there were definitely ways that race intersected with gender to shape possibilities. Cease summed this up by identifying a race-sex hierarchy in SNCC, which she defined as Black men, Black women, white men, and white women. And she showed little sensitivity to the context, instead suggesting that white supremacist violence was just an excuse for oppressing white women. In contrast, Mary King noted in her interview with Evans that most whites were smart enough to know that if they had skills, they should work in areas where they had skills rather than trying to go out and do the things that Blacks were more qualified for. At least that's what seemed to be true until 1964. That was actually a quote by Mary King. The intersection between race and gender, the specific roles of Black women and white women are very important to the history, but not in the simplistic or superficial ways that some authors have suggested. In fact, it would be a mistake to separate out or dismiss the position paper and related parts of the history as being solely about white women, as is sometimes suggested. From SNCC's earliest days, Black women played key roles, even when doing so required ignoring administrators and curfews at their colleges or challenging male counterparts who saw themselves as rightful leaders. In fact, being in the movement pretty much required defying all kinds of societal norms and expectations. Black women were neither immune to the chauvinism nor prepared to accept irrational limitations. And this picture gives us another key piece of the history. This action by Black women is evident in January 1964 in an event that was documented in this photo. Almost a year before the position paper on women, a Black-dominated group of SNCC women working in the Atlanta office held a sit-in, carrying signs reading "unfair" and "no work until justice comes." These women insisted that men share the tedious work of taking and preparing minutes, a big task since SNCC was known for extended discussions and meetings that lasted for days. 4 of the 5 women in the photo of the protest are African American. The only white woman, Mary King, provides a direct link between the lesser known protest and the later position paper. And despite almost universal assumptions to the contrary, some Black women recall being part of conversations about gender. There's evidence that at least some people thoughtfully considered the issues raised in the position paper and discussed them at the Waveland retreat. When we look at the actual minutes from the Waveland conference, we learn that Black staffer Prathia Hall asked, quote, the steering committee to allot some time for serious discussion of women in the movement. And quote, end quote. And according to the minutes, some people, quote, felt the need to seriously discuss the role and problem of women and thus of men within SNCC. That is, not only were SNCC women not shouted down by Carmichael, but some of them engaged in a discussion with their brothers. Bernice Johnson Regan, speaking from the floor at the Trinity Conference panel, also made an important point. She says that though both Mary King and Casey Hayden were white women, the fact that they were on SNCC staff was the most important aspect of their identity. She noted that King and Hayden were too often separated from SNCC, and as a result, their achievement, critiquing sexism when it was going unchallenged elsewhere, was attributed to them as individuals, as white women, separate from their status as SNCC staffers. She concluded, we really have to watch racism, because if the group is integrated and an energy is created by some white people in the group, often when it's transmitted to the larger culture, people separate it out as if it was not created by the structure that made it possible. She ends, quote, I mean, people really try to make stuff white, even when it ain't. Judy Richardson, one of 6 SNCC women who edited Hands on the Freedom Plow, personal accounts by women in SNCC, says she still gets questions informed by the misinformation I opened this presentation with. And that's one of the things that motivated her work on Hands. If you're not familiar with it, it's the starting place for anyone interested in learning about SNCC women. It includes accounts by 52 different women. My approach in writing about SNCC women is to start with Ms. Baker and the sit-ins. I think this is key to the organization's unusual gender dynamics in all of its complexity. But it's also important to revisit and challenge the misconceptions, and that's something that Duke's archives have helped me to do. There are no shortcuts in doing this history. I've done about 90 interviews myself and visited a lot of archives, some of them more than once, and I have more to go. In fact, I need to revisit Duke. Since this research around 2014, 2015, the Franklin Research Center, led by John Gartrell, has added a number of significant collections related to SNCC, including Judy Richardson's papers, where I first saw an original of the 1964 memo by Casey and Mary. This was especially important because it included the women it was addressed to. And I'll stop there, but I'd love to discuss this further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily, so much. That was very rich. And I would love for those in the audience who have questions, please feel free to submit a question and or a comment in the Q&A or the chat. I did notice that we got a chat very early on from Ori, who happens to be the graduate intern for the Franklin Center this year. And she mentioned that she never knew the backstory behind the position paper. So I guess one of my questions for you, Emily, just to kind of get things started is, what was your starting point on trying to sift through the misinformation as you describe it? How did you get to the place of beginning to ask those kind of probing questions that got you into the archive?
Well, you know, one of the things is I was fortunate enough to meet some people in SNCC. I mean, I actually read Sarah Evans' book when I was in college, and I had grown up in Mississippi, and I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't crazy about the book. And I think part of it was her focus on interracial sex as a tension point in the movement. And, um, you know, I didn't really know much about the movement at that point. But I was fortunate enough to meet some SNCC people while I was doing my earlier work before I started focusing on SNCC. And none of the SNCC women pretty much rejected out of hand this story that they were oppressed, this story of the position paper. I read Mary King's memoir, and she goes to great lengths to provide context and say that she and Casey were really very motivated by the difference between the opportunities that they experienced in SNCC and these examples of chauvinism. And they thought that SNCC was open enough, it was an open enough space that they could raise these questions that they couldn't really raise in other parts of the society. And so it was really listening to SNCC women that made me raise the question in the first place. And I can't remember exactly when I decided to start tracking it down. I think I was working on one of the things that I had wanted to talk about, but I didn't have time, is you never know what you're going to find in an archive and what kind of sidetracks you'll end up taking. And so one of the things that I found in the Sinsheimer papers that was really interesting was a transcript of a conference that was hosted by Millsaps and Tougaloo colleges in 1979. This sounds like a detour, but I'll circle back. And in it, SNCC people were just really angry with Claiborne Carson, the historian, and he was sort of a stand-in, I think, for historians generally with the way they had been portrayed in early top-down histories. And I was very interested in Circle of Trust, the book that has the transcripts of the Trinity conference that I mentioned, because it's the first really sort of collective accounting of SNCC people telling their story together. And the chapter on women is really interesting. And I've actually kind of gotten sidetracked in looking at the ways SNCC people have influenced the telling of their own history and how they've organized conferences and written books and influenced films and done all kinds of things to try to shape the way their history is told. And I think they've had some important influences. And so I think it was while I was working on a part of that project, and I was trying to track down, I just decided, where does this come from? You know, and Mary King pointed me to Robin Morgan. I mean, I'm like, well, where does that come from? And I started Googling, and that actually brought me to the Duke archives. And I realized just how pervasive it was, just all these people using the exact same language. And the language is so similar that you know that it has to come from a common source, or there are some overlapping sources, because it's just, you know, all of these people didn't have the same bad, you know, information coming from different locations. At least it didn't make sense to me. And so that's kind of what got me started on that piece of it.
Hmm. So what other questions have emerged for you as you've done this work? I mean, do you feel like I know you mentioned there's probably a couple people that you still need to talk to,
Yeah.
but do you feel like you've kind of closed the circle on this, or?
You know, I still wonder, you know, Myrna Wood went through Atlanta. She wasn't there for very long, but and I'm not sure she was even I know that some of her comments about Ruby Doris spoke to racial tension, and yet, you know, I think she respected her enough that she decided to write that obituary when she passed away, which is one of, you know, it's important in kind of making Ruby Doris visible in some circles where she might not have been otherwise. But she really couldn't help me with, except that she knew that she didn't know that firsthand. She knew she had heard stories. And so I think Cease really is an important person, and I would love to know how to connect with her, although I haven't spent a lot of time searching. I did, I think, some quick Google searches. Um, but even then, I would expect somebody who had firsthand experience in Mississippi in summer of 64 to have a little bit more nuanced experience. One thing that there's actually a slide that's lower. You know, a lot of people are open to sort of realizing, gee, I got that wrong. I didn't know the full story. But you know, there's a woman named Susan Brown Miller, and she seems determined to actually hang on to the wrong story. And so she reviewed a book called Deep in Our Hearts. It was published a while ago by white women in the movement. And in it, Casey Hayden talked about this position paper and the experience that she had. And she talked about SNCC as a positive experience. And, you know, Susan Brown Miller in her review is really critical of Casey Hayden. And I know that there are a few other people that want to cling to the idea that Ruby Doris somehow was involved in the position paper. One person told me, well, maybe she didn't write it, but she still read it, you know, and I don't see any evidence of that. I don't understand why. And so, yeah, in some ways I do think I'm stuck, but I think that the answer I've been trying to look, I guess, in the circles of people who had some contact with SNCC and the women's liberation movement. And the biggest group of people that includes that are white women who were Freedom Summer volunteers. And so I think that's probably where the answer is. I think that's the link, but whether I'll ever actually find it, I don't know. I don't really know anywhere else to go other than to keep talking to people. So if there's somebody that knows something about it, I'd love to hear from them. You know, I don't know if there are other questions, but you know, one of the things that I find really interesting about looking at SNCC women generally is there's really nothing to say at the beginning that SNCC should have had a different trajectory than other organizations. So when I look at the archives at the early days, there are two conferences that SNCC held in 1960, one in April and one in October. And I've looked at the names, and roughly 70% of the people who attended as delegates from different colleges, and that's basically people that were involved in demonstrations and were at the conference representing either their school or their state. 70% of them are men. And so it's definitely, you know, has a male majority. Out of the first representatives who came to what they called the SNCC coordinating committee meetings, all 9 of the people at the first meeting were men. And so you can really see the context of the society where there's an expectation of male leadership. It's not a given that SNCC was going to be open to women. There's a period in 1961, summer, fall 1961. It's kind of a big moment where people in SNCC goes from being a coordinating committee, connecting people from different college campuses, doing their own thing, to being what becomes an organization of organizers. And that happens when SNCC sends people into Mississippi to begin doing voter registration work, is how it begins. And people in SNCC talk about the first 16, that there were 16 people who decided to drop out of school or to give up jobs or to skip graduate school, put it on hold, to work full-time in the movement. They didn't know, you know, how they're going to get paid or anything like that. And they decided to make a leap of faith almost. And as far as I can tell, maybe 3 of the 16 are women. And so again, there's nothing obvious. At the same time, that same summer of 1960, where the representatives are almost all male, the key people, the key thing there are 2 key things that happen in summer of 1960. SNCC sends 2 representatives to the Republican and Democratic National Convention, one in California and one in Chicago. And they try to introduce a plank, related to the civil rights movement and get support for it. And the two representatives that went were Marion Barry, and I can't remember, Bernard Lee was the other. So two men. But back in Atlanta, the main work was supporting the men that were doing that, keeping in touch with all of the different campuses, and also organizing this October conference. And the main people doing that work were all women. It was Jane Stembridge, who was mentioned in the presentation, a white Southern woman who was the first paid staffer for SNCC. And she got that job because she was actually in seminary at Union Theological in New York. And she came to the SNCC founding meeting in a carload of people. She was a Southerner, and she felt like segregation was limiting to her as well. And she also knew Bayard Rustin, and he introduced her to Ella Baker, and SNCC was looking for somebody to just be kind of coordinating people. And so she got that job. And so there's tons of letters from Jane Stembridge that summer. And, Linda Cease described her as a typist, but she was making decisions. She's keeping people in touch. She's doing all kinds of thinking work. There's this great quote by Casey Hayden where she says, I did the typing and the thinking. I did the research and the mimeograph. And I think that that's a big part of SNCC. Everybody did whatever work needed doing, and whatever you could do, you took, you filled the space that there was. And so Jane was doing a lot of independent work. She wasn't just following the directions of some man as a typist. And she was working very closely with Connie Curry, who was kind of an informal advisor at that point of SNCC, another white Southern woman. She was working with the National Student Association Southern Project. And then Ella Baker was the key person. She was in and out of Atlanta. And so it's really kind of funny. On the one hand, it looks very male. On the other hand, there are these women that are doing the day-to-day work, making decisions, shaping the conference, opening up this space. And because of Ella Baker, Ella Baker has to be the most important reason that SNCC was shaped the way it was. But there was nothing to say that SNCC was going to listen to Ella Baker. Other people worked with other organizations and hadn't had that same kind of influence. So, I could talk more about that, but I don't know if there are other questions.
Yeah, so again, if anyone has a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. I guess another question that I had, you mentioned your students and their I guess their questions about sexism in SNCC in particular. And I'm curious how they receive, or what are some of the questions they're asking of you as they start to study the movement alongside, and SNCC in particular, alongside the women's liberation movement? Because it seems to me that I'm thinking about the quote that you share with from Bernice Johnson Reagan, that the narrative, the large narrative of the women's liberation movement is mostly centered on the white woman's experience. And there doesn't seem to be much acknowledgement that many of the white women whose voices emerged in that movement came from organizations like SNCC, which was predominantly Black, right? And so how do students kind of grapple with those realities?
It's interesting because I think it's unfortunate, because I think that's part of what Sarah Evans was trying to say, that the women's liberation movement owes something to the civil rights movement, and specifically to SNCC. But I think, unfortunately, some of the way she said it and the way it has been combined with the other information, and I think that's not what people take from it, unfortunately. And some of that is how she did it. But in terms of my students and that, that's just and I guess I also think, what if the women's liberation movement had gotten the right history of SNCC? How different would that history have been? Would it have been a more integrated movement? Would there have been more space for Black and white women to work together around shared or overlapping concerns? I don't know. But, because of all of that, I think a lot of women in SNCC really distance themselves from the women's movement,
Mm.
even though they're very feminist in their beliefs and their actions and all that. But your question about my students. So a lot of times I would get those questions when I was a young teacher and I was teaching a class on the 60s, and they would read the document, and it was almost like they would read the document in this document reader, and everything that we had done all semester would be like out the door, and I was like, wait, can we think about this document in light of what you've been studying, what you already know about the civil rights movement? And so, one thing I've done is, now that Hands on the Freedom Plow is out, my class on the civil rights movement, we use that book. And so they just read so many different accounts of women who have very different experiences. And so I'm about to collect a set of papers based on their reading in Hands. And I bet I get a bunch of papers on women in the movement. And they're going to be much better because now they have a really diverse set of voices that they're listening to. And I also, where I teach the story of SNCC and the women's liberation movement is more in upper level classes. And I think, I do it in a way that really emphasizes the importance and the role of SNCC. And so because of the way I set it up, my students, I think, are pretty receptive to that. But when students start, I think before students know very much, they're very idealistic, and they think that people that are involved in a justice movement, are going to want justice for everybody,
Mm.
and so
Mm.
it's hard for them to see any hint that, that there's any kind of discrimination, and so, we talk about the nuances, right? And stuff. But I think it's important for them to really think very, very much that race has a huge factor, that it's not just a simplistic question of women, that we have to talk about white women and Black women. We have to talk about, is it SNCC in 1960 and 61 and 2 and 3, or is it SNCC
Mm.
64 and 65? Because very clearly, Mary King and Casey Hayden have both said that in some ways they were influenced to write that paper because they were feeling like there was less room for them in SNCC as white women, as white people,
Mm.
than because of their role as women. There's some other things I've thought about with the Waveland paper that I haven't had a chance to really write up yet. But, Mary King even mentions this, I think, in her interview with Sarah Evans. Before 1964, very few white women worked in the field except in Southwest Georgia. Southwest Georgia was an explicitly interracial project, and they very much wanted to have white women, Black women, white men, Black men, all working together in the field. Now, they were very careful to not work so that women work together and men work together. They didn't have white women and Black men in the same team working together in the field. But they, that was a part of the Southwest Georgia project, and they had a special orientation to make sure, people knew what not to do to bring down danger on the project because of that. But in Mississippi, Jane Stembridge was the first white woman to work in the field, and that didn't happen until 1963. And it only happened because she had a personal relationship with Bob Moses and was willing to agree to his limitations. And she was very explicit about that when she talked to me. By summer of 64, with Freedom Summer, you have, despite what C says, even having white women working in freedom schools was a huge change. And just suddenly there's white women all over the state. People like Mrs. Hamer were upset that they were, violating some of the community's mores about hanging out with young men in the community, how they
mm,
dressed. And she was worried about the safety, of people in the community. But it just kind of busted open what was possible for women and white women in SNCC. And yet, meanwhile, a woman like Mary King, who's been with the organization longer, is in an office job. And
mm,
I think so that you get, she, Casey Hayden, they're doing work that's in the office, but it's very respected and it's very integral to SNCC. Suddenly, there's a huge explosion of white people in the organization, which is uncomfortable. There's people don't know, which is uncomfortable. It's gone from being a small, close knit to a large organization, which is uncomfortable. So all of this is happening at the same time. And you get this battle between what's called the hardliners and the floaters. And a lot of times the position paper was associated with the floaters and people that were leaving one job. And, so like Mary King and Casey Hayden Casey's job ended with the end of the summer. Mary left her job that she was doing in the summer, and they both try to create this photography project. Well, Julian
mm,
Bond writes this letter to Mary King where he's really upset. He's like, you've left the office. We needed you there, kind of. But white women are like, other people are doing other things. I want to do other things. And so you get kind of what the organization needs versus the person's, desire to expand their opportunities are kind of coming head to head at
mm.
this point where there's just tremendous change. And so I'm not sure. I'm just kind of, talking about some of the things I've been thinking about with Waveland and that position paper. But it's a complicated history. I don't think there's a easy way to grapple with, race and gender in that time period. But I don't think it's been done very well. I will say that. I think there's a lot we still have to figure out.
I mean, I feel like in what you just shared, the thing that came to me was that as a historian, you're having the difficult task of trying to sort through what is written and how much of it is personal and how much of it is reflective on
Yeah.
what the organization was like.
Yes.
And you're constantly looking at
Yeah.
the only perspective you have is the prism through which the author is writing. And so unless they explicitly say, like, this is how I'm actually feeling right now about my role in this organization,
Yeah.
is when you have to start putting all those pieces together.
Yeah, so like I have these letters that Mary King wrote to Elizabeth Montgomery, not Elizabeth Montgomery, Elizabeth Elizabeth Martinez Sutherland. And she talks about the difficulty of being a white woman in SNCC at that particular
Yeah.
time period. And so she's not, and um, it's really, there's a really good paper on oral histories and women and gender in SNCC, and the author of the paper basically argues that SNCC women tell the story differently at different points depending on what's happening in the larger society at the time. And
Mm,
so it's really interesting to read different interviews that other people have done. Of course, I wish they'd ask different questions sometimes or talk to different people, but you really do get these different snapshots at different moments in time. But I have to say, I was so excited when I looked at the minutes from Waveland and they actually mentioned the position paper, or they mentioned this desire to have a conversation about it.
mm,
Nobody was like, I mean, everybody acts like the position paper was dismissed, it was ignored, but according to the minutes, a couple of subgroups of people decided it was important and talked about it.
mm,
What they said, who knows? I don't know. And then there are Black women who talk about, yeah, people did bring up this question of gender. Now, there are two papers, and I don't know which paper they're talking about. You can't, it's like really hard to, on the one hand, oral histories are really important. On the other hand, you can't take them as gospel, and you have to
mhm,
try to
mhm,
line them up. And, people's memories, are not always precise, so even if the memory is accurate, was it the 64 paper or the 65 paper? Was it something else entirely? Like, I mean, it was shocking to read Sarah Evans' interview with Mary King, and she's asking her about Ruby Doris's memo, and Mary King doesn't recognize that it's her memo, you know? Like, she's like, I don't remember Ruby Doris writing a memo.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that comes up in the interviews that Sarah Evans did is all of these people say, I can't imagine anybody oppressing Ruby Doris. Nobody would oppress Ruby Doris. You know, that is just comes really clear, you know, that she just had a lot of power and respect in the organization. And, you know, so it's rich. It's a really rich history. I, yeah, I love working on it. I wish it was a full-time job. It is a full-time job.
Well, thank you so much, Emily, and I really appreciate, and I'm sure the audience appreciates all the work that you've done on this topic, and for just sharing it with us, and for participating in the speaker series. I will always be grateful, not just for your work as a scholar, but just your friendship as well. So um, I think we're gonna end the recording here, and thanks again so much.
Thank you, John. And thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity. I was really glad to have the opportunity to talk about it, pull these thoughts together. And, you know, I wouldn't have been able to do it without the work of the Duke Archives. So my hat's off to you and all the other wonderful archivists who make the work we do possible. So thank you very much. And until the next time.
Absolutely.